Today we're going to be talking about an ultra realistic presentation that's called reeling a jig. This is one of my favorite presentations for fishing a jig because it is so realistic, and you'll see it here in the underwater footage just how good it looks. And I call it reeling a jig because that's exactly what we are doing. In this particular setup, I have a 1/2 ounce football jig with just a regular Rage Craw trailer on here because of all the action that it gives. And I like the 1/2 ounce because the places that I fish this and the way I present it, I need that weight to make this lure look even more realistic. So today we'll be talking about that reeling a jig, but if you really want to stay tuned for some lessons on skipping a jig, we're going to talk about that video at the end of this one, so make sure that you stay tuned for that. Now, as far as the types of areas and locations where reeling a jig really shines is if you've got some rock, small rock, or in a lot of situations, this is where I like kind of a silty or a slightly muddy bottom. If you spent much time watching crawfish, and if you're bass anglers, I know that you have, you know that they scoot backwards, and oftentimes if they're in a silty situation with just a little bit of mud on the bottom, when they scoot backwards, they have a poof, just a slight poof, and bass key in on that. They know when they see that poof, that was one of their favorite snacks, is scooting around, and that is what this particular presentation does so well. So I like to fish this in those types of bottoms we talked about, rocky or silty bottoms, but I also like to really fish it in some shallow water, and then also water where it has those bare banks kind of just dropping down into deep water up to about a 45-degree bank. And I will go ahead, and I've got a small little silty area, rocky area out here, and I just throw it out, let that bait go ahead and thump, get all the way down there to the bottom. And then as far as the presentation, it's so simple. Literally just crank, crank. That is it. You're just reeling it about 1 revolution. Now, if you've got a high-speed reel, and many anglers do, especially for their jig setups, you just want to be slow with that presentation. 1 time around, a 1/2 time around, and you can take a look here and see how ultra realistic this jig is as it is sliding and scooting along the bottom. I'm not popping it. Okay, it's not 100% drag. I'm trying to mimic that crawdad, just scooting a few inches at a time. So literally just scoot, slight reel, slight reel. You want to make sure that you are reeling this slowly. Crawfish aren't going to, jump, 10 foot at a time. They're going to just move really slowly. So let it hit the bottom, and then just a slight reel. Okay, it's very similar to Tommy Biffel's hardhead method, but in that particular situation, he's just reeling it pretty steady, and because he's using a swing head on that jig, it has more rotation and flexibility to it. It can pound through the rocks quickly, and a lot of times in that hardhead method, he will reel that pretty fast. And here's a link to one of those videos on the Tommy Biffle hardhead method. But this one is just a standard football jig, not a swing head. You sure could use a swing head, but I just move it nice and slow. Okay, I'm trying to mimic that crawfish as absolutely as close to perfect as I can. Now, the bite on this particular method, most of the time, you're gonna feel a pretty good thump. It's gonna whack it pretty good, and like traditional jig fishing, you can go ahead and just rear back, give that traditional hard hook set with a jig like you normally would. Now, you definitely, because of where you're fishing this in the rocks and on the bottom, you do want to check your line fairly often, that you are not putting any frays in there whatsoever. And I do have a fluorocarbon leader on my braid here, so I do want to check it fairly often and make sure that I don't have any nicks or any of that type of stuff going on. And this little guy fell for the reeling a jig. Little, but they like it. I mean, that's a mouthful. He definitely wants it. There are a variety of trailers that you can use for this particular presentation, but I really like to just stick with a regular craw. Now, this is a Rage craw in here, like I mentioned earlier, but I did trim off a little bit of the body because I wanted to shorten it up and make it a little bit bulkier. But you can go ahead and use traditional chunk, or you can use a twin tail grub. Any of those work really, really well. But whatever you pick, you are trying to imitate those crawfish the best that you can. Now, if you want to practice your jig skipping where you can get that thing right up there underneath brush, make sure that you go ahead and click on this video right here. I'll go through all the setups and the most important factors of being a successful jig skipper, so make sure you go ahead and check that out. And don't forget to go out and encourage someone today, because you never know how you might just change their life forever. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.